Second part of chapter 9 of the first volume of The Life of Reason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Fredrik Karlsson. The Life of Reason by George Santayana. Side note. Consciousness expresses vital equilibrium and docility. We saw in the beginning that the exigencies of bodily life gave consciousness its first articulation. A bodily feat, like nutrition or reproduction, is celebrated by a festival in the mind, and consciousness is a sort of ritual solemnizing by prayer, jubilation, or mourning, the chief episodes in the body's fortunes. The organs, by their structure, select the impressions possible to them from the diverse influences abroad in the world, all of which, if animal organisms had learned to feed upon them, might plausibly have offered a basis for sensation. Every instinct or habitual impulse further selects from the passing bodily affections those that are pertinent to its own operation and which consequently adhere to it and modify its reactive machinery. Prevalent and notable sensations are therefore signs, presumably marking the presence of objects important for the body's welfare or for the execution of its predestined offices. So that not only are the soul's aims transcripts of the body's tendencies, but all ideas are grafted upon the interplay of these tendencies with environing forces. Early images hover about primary wants as highest conceptions do about ultimate achievements. Side note. Its worthlessness as a cause and value as an expression. Thought is essentially practical in the sense that but for thought no motion would be an action, no change a progress. But thought is in no way instrumental or servile. It is an experience realized, not a force to be used. That same spontaneity in nature which has suggested a good must be trusted to fulfill it. If we look fairly at the actual resources of our minds, we perceive that we are as little informed concerning the means and processes of action as concerning the reason why our motives move us. To execute the simplest intention we must rely on fate. Our own acts are mysteries to us. Do I know how I open my eyes or how I walk downstairs? Is it the supervising wisdom of consciousness that guides me in these acts? Is it the mind that controls the bewildered body and points out the way to physical habits uncertain of their affinities? Or is it not much rather automatic inward machinery that executes the marvellous work, while the mind catches here and there some glimpse of the operation, now with delight and adhesion, now with impotent rebellion? When impulses work themselves out unimpeded, we say we act. When they are thwarted, we say we are acted upon. But in neither case do we in the least understand the natural history of what is occurring. The mind at best vaguely forecasts the result of action. A schematic verbal sense of the end to be accomplished possibly hovers in consciousness while the act is being performed. But this premonition is itself the sense of a process already present and betrays the tendency at work. It can obviously give no aid or direction to the unknown mechanical process that produced it and that must realize its own prophecy, if that prophecy is to be realized at all. That such an unknown mechanism exists and is adequate to explain every so-called decision is indeed a hypothesis far outrunning detailed verification, although conceived by legitimate analogy with whatever is known about natural processes. But that the mind is not the source of itself or its own transformations is a matter of present experience. For the world is an unaccountable datum in its existence, in its laws, and in its incidents. The highest hopes of science and morality look only to discovering those laws and bringing one set of incidents, facts of perception, into harmony with another set, facts of preference. This hoped for issue, if it comes, must come about in the mind, but the mind cannot be its cause since, by hypothesis, it does not possess the ideas it seeks nor has power to realize the harmonies it desiderates. These have to be waited for and begged of destiny. Human will, not controlling its basis, cannot possibly control its effects. Its existence and its efforts have at best the value of a good omen. They show in what direction natural forces are moving in so far as they are embodied in given men. Sidenote: thoughts march automatic and thereby implicated in events. Men, like all things else in the world, are products and vehicles of natural energy, and their operation counts. But their conscious will, in its moral assertiveness, is merely a sign of that energy and of that will's eventual fortunes. Dramatic terror and dramatic humour both depend on contrasting the natural pregnancy of a passion with its conscious intent. Everything in human life is ominous, even the voluntary acts. We cannot, by taking thought, add a cubit to our stature, but we may build up a world without meaning it. Man is as full of potentiality as he is of impotence. A will that represents many active forces and is skilful in divination and augury may long boast to be almighty without being contradicted by the event. Sidenote: contemplative essence of action. That thought is not self-directive appears best in the most immaterial processes. In strife against external forces, men, being ignorant of their deeper selves, attribute the obvious effects of their action to their chance ideas. But when the process is wholly internal, the real factors are more evenly represented in consciousness, and the magical, involuntary nature of life is better perceived. My hand, guided by I know not what machinery, is at this moment adding syllable to syllable upon this paper, to the general fulfilment, perhaps, of my felt intent, yet giving that intent an articulation wholly unforeseen and often disappointing. The thoughts to be expressed simmer half consciously in my brain. I feel their burden and tendency without seeing their form, until the mechanical train of impulse, association, started by the perusal of what precedes or by the accidental emergence of some new idea, lights the fuse and precipitates the phrases. If this happens in the most reflective and deliberate of activities, like this of composition, how much more does it happen in positive action? The die is cast, said Caesar, feeling a decision in himself of which he could neither count nor weigh the multitudinous causes, and so says every strong and clear intellect, every well-formed character, seizing at the same moment with comprehensive instinct both its purposes and the means by which they shall be attained. Only the fool, whose will signifies nothing, boasts to have created it himself. We must not seek the function of thought, then, in any supposed power to discover either ends not suggested by natural impulse or means to the accomplishment of those irrational ends. Attention is utterly powerless to change or create its objects in either respect. It rather registers without surprise, for it expects nothing in particular, and watches eagerly the images bubbling up in the living mind and the processes evolving there. These processes are themselves full of potency and promise. Will and reflection are no more inconsequential than any other processes bound by natural links to the rest of the world. Even if an atomic mechanism suffices to mark the concatenation of everything in nature, including the mind, it cannot rob what it abstracts from of its natural weight and reality. A thread that may suffice to hold the pearls together is not the whole cause of the necklace. But this pregnancy of implication of thought in relation to its natural environment is purely empirical. Since natural connection is merely a principle of arrangement by which the contiguities of things may be described and inferred, there is no difficulty in admitting consciousness and all its works into the web and woof of nature. Each psychic episode would be heralded by its material antecedents, its transformations would be subject to mechanical laws, which would also preside over the further transition from thought into its material expression. [Sidenote: Mechanical efficacy alien to thought's essence. This inclusion of mind in nature, however, is as far as possible from constituting the mind's function and value, or its efficacy in a moral and rational sense. To have prepared changes in matter would give no rationality to mind unless those changes in turn paved the way to some better mental existence. The worth of natural efficacy is therefore always derivative. The utility of mind would be no more precious than the utility of matter. Both borrow all their worth from the part they may play empirically in introducing those moral values which are intrinsic and self-sufficing. In so far as thought is instrumental, it is not worth having, any more than matter, except for its promise. It must terminate in something truly profitable and ultimate which, being good in itself, may lend value to all that led up to it. But this ultimate good is itself consciousness, thought, rational activity, so that what instrumental mentality may have preceded might be abolished without loss. If matter suffices to sustain reason in being, or if that instrumental mentality is worth retaining, it is so only because it already contains some premonition and image of its own fulfillment. In a word, the value of thought is ideal. The material efficacy which may be attributed to it is the proper efficacy of matter, an efficacy which matter would doubtless claim if we knew enough of its secret mechanism. And when that imputed and incongruous utility was subtracted from ideas, they would appear in their proper form of expressions, realizations, ultimate fruits. [Sidenote: Consciousness transcendental. The incongruity of making thought, in its moral and logical essence, an instrument in the natural world, will appear from a different point of view if we shift the discussion for a moment to a transcendental level. Since the material world is an object for thought, and potential in relation to immediate experience, it can hardly lie in the same plane of reality with the thought to which it appears. The spectator on this side of the footlights, while surely regarded by the play as a whole, cannot expect to figure in its mechanism or to see himself strutting among the actors on the boards. He listens and is served, being at once impotent and supreme. It has been well said that only the free divine the laws, the causeless only know the cause. Conversely, what in such a transcendental sense is causeless and free will evidently not be causal or determinate, being something altogether universal and notional, without inherent determinations or specific affinities. The objects figuring in consciousness will have implications and will require causes. Not so the consciousness itself. The ego, to which all things appear equally, whatever their form or history, is the ground of nothing incidental. No specific characters or order found in the world can be attributed to its efficacy. The march of experience is not determined by the mere fact that experience exists. Another experience, differently logical, might be equally real. Consciousness is not itself dynamic, for it has no body, no idiosyncrasy or particular locus to be the point of origin for definite relationships. It is merely an abstract name for the actuality of its random objects. All force, implication, or direction inhere in the constitution of specific objects and live in their interplay. Logic is revealed to thought no less than nature is, and even what we call invention or fancy is generated not by thought itself, but by the chance fertility of nebulous objects floating and breeding in the primeval chaos. Where the natural order lapses, if it ever does, not mind or will or reason can possibly intervene to fill the chasm, for these are parcels and expressions of the natural order, but only nothingness and pure chance. End of chapter 9, part 2. Third part of chapter 9 of the first volume of The Life of Reason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Fredrik Karlsson. The Life of Reason by George Santayana. Side note. And transcendent. Thought is thus an expression of natural relations, as will is of natural affinities. Yet consciousness of an object's value, while it declares the blind disposition to pursue that object, constitutes its entire worth. Apart from the pains and satisfactions involved, an impulse and its execution would be alike destitute of importance. It would matter nothing how chaotic or how orderly the world became, or what animal bodies arose or perished there. Any tendencies afoot in nature, whatever they might construct or dissolve, would involve no progress or disaster, since no preferences would exist to pronounce one eventual state of things better than another. These preferences are in themselves, if the dynamic order alone be considered, works of supererogation, expressing force but not producing it, like a statue of Hercules. But the principle of such preferences, the force they express and depend upon, is some mechanical impulse itself, involved in the causal process. Expression gives value to power, and the strength of Hercules would have no virtue in it had it contributed nothing to art and civilization. That conceived basis of all life which we call matter would be a mere potentiality, an inferred instrument deprived of its function, if it did not actually issue in life and consciousness. What gives the material world a legitimate status and perpetual pertinence in human discourse is the conscious life it supports and carries in its own direction, as a ship carries its passengers, or rather as a passion carries its hopes. Conscious interests first justify and moralize the mechanisms they express. Eventual satisfactions, while their form and possibility must be determined by animal tendencies, alone render these tendencies vehicles of the good. The direction in which benefit shall lie must be determined by irrational impulse. But the attainment of benefit consists in crowning that impulse with its ideal achievement. Nature dictates what men shall seek and prompts them to seek it. A possibility of happiness is thus generated, and only its fulfilment would justify nature and man in their common venture. Sidenote: it is the seat of value. Satisfaction is the touchstone of value. Without reference to it, all talk about good and evil, progress or decay, is merely confused verbiage, pure sophistry in which the juggler adroitly withdraws attention from what works the wonder, namely, that human and moral colouring to which the term he plays with owe whatever efficacy they have. Metaphysicians sometimes so define the good as to make it a matter of no importance. Not seldom they give that name to the sum of all evils. A good, absolute in the sense of being divorced from all natural demand and all possible satisfaction, would be as remote as possible from goodness. To call it good is mere disloyalty to morals, brought about by some fantastic or dialectical passion. In excellence there is an essential bias, an opposition to the possible opposite. This bias expresses a mechanical impulse, a situation that has stirred the senses and the will. Impulse makes value possible, and the value becomes actual when the impulse issues in processes that give it satisfaction and have a conscious worth. Character is the basis of happiness, and happiness the sanction of character. Footnote D. Aristippus asked Socrates whether he knew anything good, so that if he answered by naming food or drink or money or health or strength or valour or anything of that sort, he might at once show that it was sometimes an evil. Socrates, however, knew very well that if anything troubles us, what we demand is its cure, and he replied in the most pertinent fashion. "Are you asking me," he said, "if I know anything good for a fever?" "Oh, no," said the other. "Or for sore eyes? Not that either. Or for hunger?" "No, not for hunger." "Well then," said he, "if you ask me whether I know a good that is good for nothing, I neither know it nor want to know it." End quotation. Xenophon Memorabilia, section 3, part 8. End footnote. That thought is nature's concomitant expression or entelechy, never one of her instruments, is a truth long ago divined by the more judicious thinkers like Aristotle and Spinoza. But it has not met with general acceptance or even consideration. It is obstructed by superficial empiricism, which associates the better known aspects of events directly together, without considering what mechanical bonds may secretly unite them. It is obstructed also by the traditional mythical idealism, intent as this philosophy is on proving nature to be the expression of something ulterior and non-natural, and on hugging the fatal misconception that ideals and eventual goods are creative and miraculous forces without perceiving that it thereby renders goods and ideals perfectly senseless. For how can anything be a good at all to which some existing nature is not already directed? It may therefore be worth while, before leaving this phase of the subject, to consider one or two prejudices which might make it sound paradoxical to say, as we propose, that ideals are ideal and nature natural. Sidenote: apparent utility of pain. Sidenote: its real impotence. Of all forms of consciousness, the one apparently most useful is pain, which is also the one most immersed in matter and most opposite to ideality and excellence. Its utility lies in the warning it gives. In trying to escape pain we escape destruction. That we desire to escape pain is certain. Its very definition can hardly go beyond the statement that pain is that element of feeling which we seek to abolish on account of its intrinsic quality. That this desire, however, should know how to initiate remedial action is a notion contrary to experience and in itself unthinkable. If pain could have cured us, we should long ago have been saved. The bitterest quintessence of pain is its helplessness and our incapacity to abolish it. The most intolerable torments are those we feel gaining upon us, intensifying and prolonging themselves indefinitely. This baffling quality, so conspicuous in extreme agony, is present in all pain and is perhaps its essence. If we sought to describe by a circumlocution what is of course a primary sensation, we might scarcely do better than to say that pain is consciousness at once intense and empty, fixing attention on what contains no character and arrests all satisfactions without offering anything in exchange. The horror of pain lies in its intolerable intensity and its intolerable tedium. It can, accordingly, be cured either by sleep or by entertainment. In itself it has no resource, its violence is quite helpless, and its vacancy offers no expedients by which it might be unknotted and relieved. Pain is not only impotent in itself, but is a sign of impotence in the sufferer. Its appearance, far from constituting its own remedy, is like all other organic phenomena subject to the law of inertia and tends only to its own continuance. A man's hatred of his own condition no more helps to improve it than hatred of other people tends to improve them. If we allowed ourselves to speak in such a case of efficacy at all, we should say that pain perpetuates and propagates itself in various ways, now by weakening the system, now by prompting convulsive efforts, now by spreading to other beings through the contagions of sympathy or vengeance. In fact, however, it merely betrays a maladjustment which has more or less natural stability. It may be instantaneous only; by its lack of equilibrium it may involve the immediate destruction of one of its factors. In that case we fabulously say that the pain has instinctively removed its own cause. Pain is here apparently useful because it expresses an incipient tension which the self-preserving forces in the organism are sufficient to remove. Pain's appearance is then the sign of its instant disappearance, not indeed by virtue of its inner nature or of any art it can initiate, but merely by virtue of mechanical associations between its cause and its remedy. The burned child dreads the fire, and, reading only the surface of his life, fancies that the pain once felt and still remembered is the ground of his new prudence. Punishments, however, are not always efficacious, as every one knows who has tried to govern children or cities by the rod. Suffering does not bring wisdom nor even memory, unless intelligence and docility are already there. That is, unless the friction which the pain betrayed sufficed to obliterate permanently one of the impulses in conflict. This readjustment, on which real improvement hangs, and which alone makes experience useful, does not correspond to the intensity or repetition of the pains endured. It corresponds rather to such a plasticity in the organism that the painful conflict is no longer produced. Sidenote: Preformations involved. Threatened destruction would not involve pain unless that threatened destruction were being resisted, so that the reaction which pain is supposed to cause must already be taking place before pain can be felt. A will without direction cannot be thwarted, so that inhibition cannot be the primary source of any effort or of any ideal. Determinate impulses must exist already for their inhibition to have taken place or for the pain to arise which is the sign of that inhibition. The child's dread of the fire marks the acceleration of that impulse which, when he was burned, originally enabled him to withdraw his hand. And if he did not now shrink in anticipation, he would not remember the pain nor know to what to attach his terror. Sight now suffices to awaken the reaction which touch at first was needed to produce. The will has extended its line of battle and thrown out its scouts farther afield, and pain has been driven back to the frontiers of the spirit. The conflicting reactions are now peripheral and feeble. The pain involved in aversion is nothing to that once involved in the burn. Had this aversion to fire been innate, as many aversions are, no pain would have been caused, because no profound maladjustment would have occurred. The surviving attraction, checked by fear, is a remnant of the old disorganization in the brain which was the seat of conflicting reactions. End of chapter 9, part 3. Fourth part of chapter 9 of the first volume of The Life of Reason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Fredrik Karlsson. The Life of Reason by George Santayana. Sidenote: Its untoward significance. To say that this conflict is the guide to its own issue is to talk without thinking. The conflict is the sign of inadequate organization or of non-adaptation in the given organism to the various stimuli which irritate it. The reconstruction which follows this conflict, when it indeed follows, is of course a new and better adaptation, so that what involves the pain may often be a process of training which directs reaction into new and smoother channels. But the pain is present whether a permanent adaptation is being attained or not. It is present in progressive dissolution and in hopeless and exhausting struggles far more than in education or in profitable correction. Toothache and seasickness, birth pangs and melancholia are not useful ills. The intenser the pain, the more probable its uselessness. Only in vanishing is it a sign of progress. In occurring it is an omen of defeat, just as disease is an omen of death, although for those diseased already, medicine and convalescence may be approaches to health again. Where a man's nature is out of gear and his instincts are inordinate, suffering may be a sign that a dangerous peace, in which impulse was carrying him ignorantly into paths without issue, is giving place to a peace with security, in which his reconstructed character may respond without friction to the world. and enable him to gather a clearer experience and enjoy a purer vitality. The utility of pain is thus apparent only, and due to empirical haste in collating events that have no regular nor inward relation. And even this imputed utility pain has only in proportion to the worthlessness of those who need it. [Sidenote: Perfect function, no unconscious. A second current prejudice which may deserve notice suggests that an organ, when its function is perfect, becomes unconscious, so that if adaptation were complete, life would disappear. The well-learned routine of any mechanical art passes into habit, and habit into unconscious operation. The virtuoso is not aware how he manipulates his instrument. What was conscious labor in the beginning has become instinct and miracle in the end. Thus it might appear that to eliminate friction and difficulty would be to eliminate consciousness, and therefore value, from the world. Life would thus be involved in a contradiction and moral effort in an absurdity. For while the constant aim of practice is perfection and that of labour ease, and both are without meaning or standard unless directed to the attainment of these ends, yet such attainment, if it were actual, would be worthless, so that what alone justifies effort would lack justification and would in fact be incapable of existence. The good musician must strive to play perfectly, but, alas, we are told, if he succeeded he would have become an automaton. The good man must aspire to holiness, but, alas, if he reached holiness, his moral life would have evaporated. These melodramatic prophecies, however, need not alarm us. They are founded on nothing but rhetoric and small allegiance to any genuine good. When we attain perfection of function, we lose consciousness of the medium to become more clearly conscious of the result. The eye that does its duty gives no report of itself and has no sense of muscular tension of weariness, but it gives all the brighter and steadier image of the object seen. Consciousness is not lost when focused, and the labour of vision is abolished in its fruition. So the musician, could he play so divinely as to be unconscious of his body, his instrument, and the very lapse of time, would be only the more absorbed in the harmony, more completely master of its unities and beauty. At such moments the body's long labour at last brings forth the soul. Life from its inception is simply some partial natural harmony raising its voice and bearing witness to its own existence. To perfect that harmony is to round out and intensify that life. This is the very secret of power, of joy, of intelligence. Not to have understood it is to have passed through life without understanding anything. The analogy extends to morals, where also the means may be advantageously forgotten when the end has been secured. That leisure to which work is directed and that perfection in which virtue would be fulfilled are so far from being apathetic that they are states of pure activity, by containing which other acts are rescued from utter passivity and unconsciousness. Impure feeling ranges between two extremes: absolute want and complete satisfaction. The former limit is reached in anguish, madness, or the agony of death, when the accidental flux of things in contradiction has reached its maximum or vanishing point, so that the contradiction and the flux themselves disappear by diremption. Such feeling denotes inward disorganization and a hopeless conflict of reflex actions tending toward dissolution. The second limit is reached in contemplation, when anything is loved, understood, or enjoyed. Synthetic power is then at its height. The mind can survey its experience and correlate all the motion it suggests. Power in the mind is exactly proportionate to representative scope, and representative scope to rational activity. A steady vision of all things in their true order and worth results from perfection of function and is its index. It secures the greatest distinctness in thought, together with the greatest decision, wisdom, and ease in action, as the lightning is brilliant and quick. It also secures, so far as human energies avail, its own perpetuity, since what is perfectly adjusted within and without lasts long and goes far. [Sidenote: Inchoate ethics. To confuse means with ends and mistake disorder for vitality is not unnatural to minds that hear the hum of mighty workings but can imagine neither the cause nor the fruits of that portentous commotion. All functions in such chaotic lives seem instrumental functions. It is then supposed that what serves no further purpose can have no value, and that he who suffers no offuscation can have no feeling and no life. To attain an ideal seems to destroy its worth. Moral life, at that low level, is a fantastic game only, not having come in sight of humane and liberal interests. The barbarian's intensity is without seriousness and his passion without joy. His philosophy, which means to glorify all experience and to digest all vice, is in truth an expression of pathetic innocence. It betrays a rudimentary impulse to follow every beckoning hand, to assume that no adventure and no bewitchment can be anything but glorious. Such an attitude is intelligible in one who has never seen anything worth seeing nor loved anything worth loving. Immaturity could go no farther than to acknowledge no limits defining will and happiness. When such limits, however, are gradually discovered and an authoritative ideal is born of the marriage of human nature with experience, happiness becomes at once definite and attainable, for adjustment is possible to a world that has a fruitful and intelligible structure. Such incoherences, which might well arise in ages without traditions, may be preserved and fostered by superstition. Perpetual servile employments and subjection to an irrational society may render people incapable even of conceiving a liberal life. They may come to think their happiness no longer separable from their misery, and to fear the large emptiness, as they deem it, of a happy world. Like the prisoner of Chillon, after so long a captivity, they would regain their freedom with a sigh. The wholesome influences of nature, however, would soon revive their wills, contorted by unnatural oppression, and a vision of perfection would arise within them upon breathing a purer air. Freedom and perfection are synonymous with life. The peace they bring is one whose names are also rapture, power, clear sight, and love, for these are parts of peace. [Sidenote: Thought the entelechy of being. Thought belongs to the sphere of ultimate results. What, indeed, could be more fitting than that consciousness, which is self-revealing and transcendently primary, should be its own excuse for being and should contain its own total value, together with the total value of everything else? What could be more proper than that the whole worth of ideas should be ideal? To make an idea instrumental would be to prostitute what, being self-existent, should be self-justifying. That continual absoluteness which consciousness possesses, since in it alone all heaven and earth are at any moment revealed, ought to convince any radical and heart-searching philosopher that all values should be continually integrated and realized there, where all energies are being momentally focused. Thought is a fulfilment. Its function is to lend utility to its causes and to make actual those conceived and subterranean processes which find in it their ultimate expression. Thought is nature represented. It is potential energy producing life and becoming an actual appearance. Side note: its exuberance. The conditions of consciousness, however, are far from being its only theme. As consciousness bears a transcendent relation to the dynamic world, for it is actual and spiritual, while the dynamic is potential and material, so it may be exuberant and irresponsibly rich. Although its elements, in point of distribution and derivation, are grounded in matter, as music is in vibrations, yet in point of character the result may be infinitely redundant. The complete musician would devote but a small part of his attention to the basis of music, its mechanism, psychology, or history. Long before he had represented to his mind the causes of his art, he would have proceeded to practice and enjoy it. So sense and imagination, passion and reason, may enrich the soil that breeds them and cover it with a maze of flowers. The theme of consciousness is accordingly far more than the material world which constitutes its basis, though this also is one of its themes. Thought is no less at home in various expressions and embroideries with which the material world can be overlaid in imagination. The material world is conceived by digging beneath experience to find its cause. It is the efficacious structure and skeleton of things. This is a subject of scientific retrospect and calculation. The forces disclosed by physical studies are of course not directed to producing a mind that might merely describe them. A force is expressed in many other ways than by being defined. It may be felt, resisted, embodied, transformed, or symbolized. Forces work. They are not, like mathematical concepts, exhausted in description. From that matter, which might be describable in mechanical formulae, there issue notwithstanding all manner of forms and harmonies visible, audible, imaginable, and passionately prized. Every phase of the ideal world emanates from the natural and loudly proclaims its origin by the interest it takes in natural existences, of which it gives a rational interpretation. Sense, art, religion, society express nature exuberantly, and in symbols long before science is added to represent, by a different abstraction, the mechanism which nature contains. End of chapter 9. First part of chapter 10 of the first volume of The Life of Reason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Fredrik Karlsson. The Life of Reason by George Santayana. Chapter 10. The Measure of Values in Reflection. Side note: honesty in hedonism. To put value in pleasure and pain, regarding a given quantity of pain as balancing a given quantity of pleasure, is to bring to practical ethics a worthy intention to be clear and, what is more precious, an undoubted honesty not always found in those moralists who maintain the opposite opinion and care more for edification than for truth. For in spite of all logical and psychological scruples, conduct that should not justify itself somehow by the satisfaction secured and the pains avoided would not justify itself at all. The most instinctive and unavoidable desire is forthwith chilled if you discover that its ultimate end is to be a preponderance of suffering, and what arrests this desire is not fear or weakness, but conscience in its most categorical and sacred guise. Who would not be ashamed to acknowledge or to propose so inhuman an action? By sad experience rooted impulses may be transformed or even obliterated, and quite intelligibly, for the idea of pain is already the sign and the beginning of a certain stoppage. To imagine failure is to interpret ideally a felt inhibition. To prophesy a check would be impossible but for an incipient movement already meeting an incipient arrest. Intensified, this prophecy becomes its own fulfillment and totally inhibits the opposed tendency. Therefore a mind that foresees pain to be the ultimate result of action cannot continue unreservedly to act, seeing that its foresight is the conscious transcript of a recoil already occurring. Conversely, the mind that surrenders itself wholly to any impulse must think that its execution would be delightful. A perfectly wise and representative will, therefore, would aim only at what in its attainment could continue to be aimed at and approved, and this is another way of saying that its aim would secure the maximum of satisfaction eventually possible. [Sidenote: Necessary qualifications.] In spite, however, of this involution of pain and pleasure in all deliberate forecast and volition, pain and pleasure are not the ultimate sources of value. A correct psychology and logic cannot allow that an eventual and, in strictness, unpresentable feeling can determine any act or volition, but must insist that, on the contrary, all beliefs about future experience, with all premonition of its emotional quality, is based on actual impulse and feeling, so that the source of value is nothing but the inner fountain of life and imagination, and the object of pursuit nothing but the ideal object, counterpart of the present demand. Abstract satisfaction is not pursued, but if the will and the environment are constant, satisfaction will necessarily be felt in achieving the object desired. A rejection of hedonistic psychology, therefore, by no means involves any opposition to eudaimonism in ethics. Eudaimonism is another name for wisdom. There is no other moral morality. Any system that, for some sinister reason, should absolve itself from goodwill toward all creatures and make it somehow a duty to secure their misery, would be clearly disloyal to reason, humanity, and justice. Nor would it be hard in that case to point out what superstition, what fantastic obsession, or what private fury had made those persons blind to prudence and kindness in so plain a matter. Happiness is the only sanction of life. Where happiness fails, existence remains a mad and lamentable experiment. The question, however, what happiness shall consist in, its complexion, if it should once arise, can only be determined by reference to natural demands and capacities, so that while satisfaction by the attainment of ends can alone justify their pursuit, this pursuit itself must exist first and be spontaneous, thereby fixing the goals of endeavour and distinguishing the states in which satisfaction might be found. Natural disposition, therefore, is the principle of preference and makes morality and happiness possible. [Sidenote: The will must judge.] The standard of value, like every standard, must be one. Pleasures and pains are not only infinitely diverse, but, even if reduced to their total bulk and abstract opposition, they remain two. Their values must be compared, and obviously neither one can be the standard by which to judge the other. This standard is an ideal involved in the judgment passed, whatever that judgment may be. Thus when Petrarch says that 1,000 pleasures are not worth one pain, he establishes an ideal of value deeper than either pleasure or pain, an ideal which makes a life of satisfaction marred by a single pang, an offence and a horror to his soul. If our demand for rationality is less acute, and the miscellaneous affirmations of the will carry us along with a well-fed indifference to some single tragedy within us, we may aver that a single pang is only the 1,000th part of 1,000 pleasures, and that a life so balanced is 999 times better than nothing. This judgment, for all its air of mathematical calculation, in truth expresses a choice as irrational as Petrarch's. It merely means that, as a matter of fact, the mixed prospect presented to us attracts our wills and attracts them vehemently, so that the only possible criterion for the relative values of pains and pleasures is the will that chooses among them or among combinations of them. Nor can the intensity of pleasures and pains, apart from the physical violence of their expression, be judged by any other standard than by the power they have, when represented, to control the will's movement. [Sidenote: Injustice inherent in representation. Here we come upon one of those initial irrationalities in the world theories of all sorts, since their attempts to find rationality in things are in serious danger of overlooking. In estimating the value of any experience, our endeavour, our pretension, is to weigh the value which that experience possesses when it is actual. But to weigh is to compare, and to compare is to represent, since the transcendental isolation and self-sufficiency of actual experience precludes its lying side by side with another datum, like two objects given in a single consciousness. Successive values to be compared must be represented, but the conditions of representation are such that they rob objects of the values they had at their first appearance to substitute the values they possess at their recurrence. For representation mirrors consciousness only by mirroring its objects, and the emotional reaction upon those objects cannot be represented directly, but is approached by indirect methods through an imitation or assimilation of will to will and emotion to emotion. Only by the instrumentality of signs, like gesture or language, can we bring ourselves to reproduce in some measure an absent experience and to feel some premonition of its absolute value. Apart from very elaborate and cumulative suggestions to the contrary, we should always attribute to an event in every other experience the value which its image now had in our own. But in that case the pathetic fallacy would be present. For a volitional reaction upon an idea in one vital context is no index to what the volitional reaction would be in another vital context upon the situation which that idea represents. [Sidenote: Aesthetic and speculative cruelty. This divergence falsifies all representation of life and renders it initially cruel, sentimental, and mythical. We dislike to trample on a flower because its form makes a kind of blossoming in our own fancy which we call beauty. But we laugh at pangs we endured in childhood and feel no tremor at the incalculable sufferings of all mankind beyond our horizon, because no imitable image is involved to start a contrite thrill in our own bosom. The same cruelty appears in aesthetic pleasures, in lust, war, and ambition. In the illusions of desire and memory, in the unsympathetic quality of theory everywhere which regards the uniformities of cause and effect and the beauties of law as a justification for the inherent evils in the experience described, in the unjust judgments, finally, of mystical optimism that sinks so completely into its subjective commotion as to mistake the suspension of all discriminating and representative faculties for a true union in things, and the blur of its own ecstasy for a universal glory. These pleasures are all on the sensuous plane, the plane of levity and unintentional wickedness, but in their own sphere they have their own value. Aesthetic and speculative emotions make an important contribution to the total worth of existence, but they do not abolish the evils of that experience on which they reflect with such ruthless satisfaction. The satisfaction is due to a private flood of emotions submerging the images present in fancy, or to the exercise of a new intellectual function, like that of abstraction, synthesis, or comparison. Such a faculty, when fully developed, is capable of yielding pleasures as intense and voluminous as those proper to rudimentary animal functions, wrongly supposed to be more vital. The acme of vitality lies in truth in the most comprehensive and penetrating thought. The rhythms, the sweep, the impetuosity of impassioned contemplation not only contain in themselves a great vitality and potency, but they often succeed in engaging the lower function in a sympathetic vibration, and we see the whole body and soul rapt, as we say, and borne along by the harmonies of imagination and thought. In these fugitive moments of intoxication the detail of truth is submerged and forgotten. The emotions which would be suggested by the parts are replaced by the rapid emotion of transition between them, and this exhilaration in survey, this mountain-top experience, is supposed to be also the truest vision of reality. Absorption in a supervening function is mistaken for comprehension of all fact, and this inevitably, since all consciousness of particular facts and of their values is then submerged in the torrent of cerebral excitement. [Sidenote: Imputed values, their inconstancy.] That luminous blindness which in these cases takes on extreme form is present in principle throughout all reflection. We tend to regard our own past as good only when we still find some value in the memory of it. Last year, last week, even the feelings of the last 5 minutes are not otherwise prized than by the pleasure we may still have in recalling them, the pulsations of pleasure or pain which they contained we do not even seek to remember or to discriminate. The period is called happy or unhappy merely as its ideal representation exercises fascination or repulsion over the present will. Hence the revulsion after physical indulgence, often most violent when the pleasure, judged by its concomitant expression and by the desire that heralded it, was most intense. For the strongest passions are intermittent, so that the unspeakable charm which their objects possess for a moment is lost immediately and becomes unintelligible to a chilled and cheated reflection. The situation, when yet unrealized, irresistibly solicited the will and seemed to promise incomparable ecstasy, and perhaps it yields an indescribable moment of excitement and triumph, a moment only half appropriated into waking experience, so fleeting is it, and so unfit the mind to possess or retain its tenser attitudes. The same situation, if revived in memory when the system is in an opposite and relaxed state, forfeits all power to attract and fills the mind rather with aversion and disgust. For all violent pleasures, as Shakespeare says, are cruel and not to be trusted. A bliss and proof, and proved a very woe, before a joy proposed, behind a dream. Enjoyed no sooner, but despised straight, past reason hunted, and no sooner had, past reason hated. [Sidenote: Methods of control. Past reason indeed. For although an impulsive injustice is inherent in the very nature of representation and cannot be overcome altogether, yet reason, by attending to all the evidences that can be gathered and by confronting the first pronouncement by others fetched from every quarter of experience, has power to minimize the error and reach a practically just estimate of absent values. This achieved rightness can be tested by comparing two experiences, each when it is present, with the same conventional permanent object chosen to be their expression. A love song, for instance, can be pronounced adequate or false by various lovers, and it can thus remain a sort of index to the fleeting sentiments once confronted with it. Reason has, to be sure, no independent method of discovering values. They must be rated as the sensitive balance of present inclination, when completely laden, shows them to stand. In estimating values, reason is reduced to data furnished by the mechanical processes of ideation and instinct, as in framing all knowledge. An absent joy can only be represented by a tinge of emotion, dyeing an image that pictures the situation in which the joy was felt, but the suggested value being once projected into the potential world, that land of inferred being, this projection may be controlled and corroborated by other suggestions and associations relevant to it, which it is the function of reason to collect and compare. A right estimate of absent values must be conventional and mediated by signs. Direct sympathies, which suffice for instinctive present cooperation, fail to transmit alien or opposite pleasures. They over-emphasize momentary relations, while they necessarily ignore permanent bonds. Therefore, the same intellect that puts a mechanical reality behind perception must put a moral reality behind sympathy. End of chapter 10, part 1. Second part of chapter 10 of the first volume of The Life of Reason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Fredrik Karlsson. The Life of Reason by George Santayana. [Sidenote: Example of fame. Fame, for example, is a good. Its value arises from a certain movement of will and emotion which is elicited by the thought that one's name might be associated with great deeds and with the memory of them. The glow of this thought bathes the object it describes, so that fame is felt to have a value quite distinct from that which the expectation of fame may have in the present moment. Should this expectation be foolish and destined to prove false, it would have no value, and be indeed the more ludicrous and repulsive the more pleasure its dupe took in it, and the longer his illusion lasted. The heart is resolutely set on its object and despises its own phenomena, not reflecting that its emotions have first revealed that object's worth and alone can maintain it. For if a man cares nothing for fame, what value has it? This projection of interest into excellence takes place mechanically and is in the first instance irrational. Did all glow die out from memory and expectation, the events represented remaining unchanged, we should be incapable of assigning any value to those events, just as, if eyes were lacking, we should be incapable of assigning colour to the world, which would, notwithstanding, remain as it is at present. So fame could never be regarded as a good if the idea of fame gave no pleasure. Yet now, because the idea pleases, the reality is regarded as a good, absolute and intrinsic. This moral hypostasis involved in the love of fame could never be rationalised, but would subsist unmitigated or die out unobserved were it not associated with other conceptions and other habits of estimating values. For the passions are humanised only by being juxtaposed and forced to live together. As fame is not man's only goal and the realisation of it comes into manifold relations with other interests no less vivid, we are able to criticise the impulse to pursue it. Fame may be the consequence of benefits conferred upon mankind. In that case the abstract desire for fame would be reinforced and, as it were, justified by its congruity with the more voluminous and stable desire to benefit our fellow men. Or, again, the achievements which ensure fame and the genius that wins it probably involve a high degree of vitality and many profound inward satisfactions to the man of genius himself, so that again the abstract love of fame would be reinforced by the independent and more rational desire for a noble and comprehensive experience. On the other hand, the minds of posterity, whose homage is craved by the ambitious man, will probably have very false conceptions of his thoughts and purposes. What they will call by his name will be, in a great measure, a fiction of their own fancy and not his portrait at all. Would Caesar recognise himself in the current notions of him, drawn from some school history or perhaps from Shakespeare's satirical portrait? Would Christ recognise himself upon our altars or in the romances about him constructed by imaginative critics? And not only is remote experience thus hopelessly lost and misrepresented, but even this nominal memorial ultimately disappears. The love of fame, if tempered by these and similar considerations, would tend to take a place in man's ideal, such as its roots in human nature and its functions in human progress might seem to justify. It would be rationalised in the only sense in which any primary desire can be rationalised, namely, by being combined with all others in a consistent whole. How much of it would survive a thorough sifting and criticism may well remain in doubt. The result would naturally differ for different temperaments and in different states of society. The wisest men, perhaps, while they would continue to feel some love of honour and some interest in their image in other minds, would yet wish that posterity might praise them as Sallust praises Cato by saying esse quam videri bonus maluit. He preferred worth to reputation. [Sidenote: Disproportionate interest in the aesthetic. The fact that value is attributed to absent experience, according to the value experience has in representation, appears again in one of the most curious anomalies in human life: the exorbitant interest which thought and reflection take in the form of experience, and the slight account they make of its intensity or volume. Seasickness and childbirth, when they are over, the pangs of despised love when that love is finally forgotten or requited, the travail of sin when one's salvation is assured, all melt away and dissolve like a morning mist, leaving a clear sky without a vestige of sorrow. So also with merely remembered and not reproducible pleasures, the buoyancy of youth when absurdity is not yet tedious, the rapture of sport or passion, the immense peace found in a mystical surrender to the universal, all these generous ardours count for nothing when they are once gone. The memory of them cannot cure a fit of the blues, nor raise an irritable mortal above some petty act of malice or vengeance, or reconcile him to foul weather. An ode of Horace, on the other hand, a scientific monograph, or a well-written page of music, is a better antidote to melancholy than thinking on all the happiness which one's own life or that of the universe may ever have contained. Why should overwhelming masses of suffering and joy affect imagination so little, while it responds sympathetically to aesthetic and intellectual irritants of very slight intensity, objects that, it must be confessed, are of almost no importance to the welfare of mankind? Why should we be so easily awed by artistic genius and exalt men whose works we know only by name, perhaps, and whose influence upon society has been infinitesimal, like a Pindar or a Leonardo, while we regard great merchants and inventors as ignoble creatures in comparison? Why should we smile at the inscription in Westminster Abbey which calls the inventor of the spinning jenny one of the true benefactors of mankind? Is it not probable, on the whole, that he has had a greater and less equivocal influence on human happiness than Shakespeare, with all his plays and sonnets? But the cheapness of cotton cloth produces no particularly delightful image in the fancy to be compared with Hamlet or Imogen. There is a prodigious selfishness in dreams. They live perfectly deaf and invulnerable amid the cries of the real world. [Sidenote: Irrational religious allegiance.] The same aesthetic bias appears in the moral sphere. Utilitarians have attempted to show that the human conscience commends precisely those actions which tend to secure general happiness, and that the notions of justice and virtue prevailing in any age vary with its social economy and the prices it is able to attain. And, if due allowance is made for the complexity of the subject, we may reasonably admit that the precepts of obligatory morality bear this relation to the general welfare. Thus virtue means courage in a soldier, probity in a merchant, and chastity in a woman. But if we turn from the morality required of all to the type regarded as perfect and ideal, we find no such correspondence to the benefits involved. The selfish imagination intervenes here and attributes an absolute and irrational value to those figures that entertain it with the most absorbing and dreamful emotions. The character of Christ, for instance, which even the least orthodox among us are in the habit of holding up as a perfect model, is not the character of a benefactor but of a martyr. A spirit from a higher world lacerated in its passage through this uncomprehending and perverse existence, healing and forgiving out of sheer compassion, sustained by his inner affinities to the supernatural, and absolutely disenchanted with all earthly or political goods. Christ did not suffer like Prometheus for having bestowed or wished to bestow any earthly blessing. The only blessing he bequeathed was the image of himself upon the cross, whereby men might be comforted in their own sorrows, rebuked in their worldliness, driven to put their trust in the supernatural, and united by their common indifference to the world in one mystic brotherhood. As men learned these lessons, or were inwardly ready to learn them, they recognized more and more clearly in Jesus their heaven-sent Redeemer, and in following their own conscience and desperate idealism into the desert or the cloister, in ignoring all civic virtues and allowing the wealth, art, and knowledge of the pagan world to decay, they began what they felt to be an imitation of Christ. All natural impulses, all natural ideals, subsisted of course beneath this theoretic asceticism, writhed under its unearthly control, and broke out in frequent violent eruptions against it in the life of each man as well as in the course of history. Yet the image of Christ remained in men's heart and retained its marvellous authority, so that even now, when so many who call themselves Christians, being pure children of nature, are without the least understanding of what Christianity came to do in the world, they still offer his person and words a sincere, if inarticulate worship, trying to transform that sacrificial and crucified spirit as much as their bungling fancy can into a patron of Philistia Felix. Why this persistent adoration of a character that is the extreme negation of all that these good souls inwardly value and outwardly pursue? Because the image of Christ and the associations of his religion, apart from their original import, remain rooted in the mind. They remain the focus for such wayward emotions and mystic intuitions as their magnetism can still attract, and the value which this hallowed compound possesses in representation is transferred to its nominal object, and Christ is the conventional name for all the impulses of religion, no matter how opposite to the Christian. Sidenote: pathetic idealizations. Symbols, when their significance has been great, outlive their first significance. The image of Christ was a last refuge to the world. It was a consolation and a new ground for hope, from which no misfortune could drive the worshipper. Its value as an idea was therefore immense, as to the lover the idea of his untasted joys, or to the dying man the idea of health and invigorating sunshine. The votary can no more ask himself whether this deity, in its total operation, has really blessed him and deserved his praise, than the lover can ask if his lady is worth pursuing, or the expiring cripple whether it would be in very truth a benefit to be once more young and whole. That life is worth living is the most necessary of assumptions, and, were it not assumed, the most impossible of conclusions. Experience, by its passive weight of joy and sorrow, can neither inspire nor prevent enthusiasm. Only a present ideal will avail to move the will and, if realized, to justify it. A saint's halo is an optical illusion. It glorifies his actions, whatever their eventual influence in the world, because they seem to have, when rehearsed dramatically, some tenderness or rapture or miracle about them. Thus it appears that the great figures of art or religion, together with all historic and imaginative ideals, advance insensibly on the values they represent. The image has more lustre than the original, and is often the more important and influential fact. things are esteemed as they weigh in representation. A memorable thing, people say in their eulogies, little thinking to touch the ground of their praise. For things are called great because they are memorable, they are not remembered because they were great. The deepest pangs, the highest joys, the widest influences are lost to apperception in its haste, and if in some rational moment reconstructed and acknowledged are soon forgotten again and cut off from living consideration. But the emptiest experience, even the most pernicious tendency, if embodied in a picturesque image, if reverberating in the mind with a pleasant echo, is idealized and enshrined. Fortunate indeed was Achilles that Homer sang of him, and fortunate the poets that make a public titillation out of their sorrows and ignorance. This imputed and posthumous fortune is the only happiness they have. The favours of memory are extended to those feeble realities and denied to the massive substance of daily experience. When life dies, when what was present becomes a memory, its ghost flits still among the living, feared or worshipped, not for the experience it once possessed, but for the aspect it now wears. Yet this injustice in representation, speculatively so offensive, is practically excusable. For it is in one sense right and useful that all things, whatever their original or inherent dignity, should be valued at each moment only by their present function and utility. [Sidenote: Inevitable impulsiveness in prophecy. [Sidenote: The test a controlled present ideal. The error involved in attributing value to the past is naturally aggravated when values are to be assigned to the future. In the latter case, imagination cannot be controlled by circumstantial evidence and is consequently the only basis for judgment. But as the conception of a thing naturally evokes an emotion different from that involved in its presence, ideals of what is desirable for the future contain no warrant that the experience desired would, when actual, prove to be acceptable and good. An ideal carries no extrinsic assurance that its realization would be a benefit. To convince ourselves that an ideal has rational authority and represents a better experience than the actual condition it is contrasted with, we must control the prophetic image by as many circumlocutions as possible. As in the case of fame, we must buttress or modify our spontaneous judgment with all the other judgment that the object envisaged can prompt. We must make our ideal harmonize with all experience rather than with a part only. The possible error remains even then, but a practical mind will always accept the risk of error when it has made every possible correction. A rational will is not a will that has reason for its basis, or that possesses any other proof that its realization would be possible or good than the oracle which a living will inspires and pronounces. The rationality possible to the will lies not in its source but in its method. An ideal cannot wait for its realization to prove its validity. To deserve adhesion it needs only to be adequate as an ideal, that is, to express completely what the soul at present demands and to do justice to all extant interests. End of chapter 10. First part of chapter 11 of the first volume of the Life of Reason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Fredrik Karlsson. The Life of Reason by George Santayana. Chapter 11. Some abstract conditions of the ideal. Side note: the ultimate end, a resultant. Reason's function is to embody the good, but the test of excellence is itself ideal. Therefore, before we can assure ourselves that reason has manifested in any given case, we must make out the reasonableness of the ideal that inspires us. And in general, before we can convince ourselves that a life of reason or practice guided by science and directed toward spiritual goods is at all worth having, we must make out the possibility and character of its ultimate end. Yet each ideal is its own justification, so that the only sense in which an ultimate end can be established and become a test of general progress is this: that a harmony and cooperation of impulses should be conceived, leading to the maximum satisfaction possible in the whole community of spirits affected by our action. Now, without considering for the present any concrete utopia, such, for instance, as Plato's Republic or the heavenly beatitude described by theologians, we may inquire what formal qualities are imposed on the ideal by its nature and function by the relation it bears to experience and to desire. Side note: demands the substance of ideals. The ideal has the same relation to given demands that the reality has given perceptions. In the face of the ideal, particular demands forfeit their authority, and the goods to which a particular being may aspire cease to be absolute. Nay, the satisfaction of desire comes to appear an indifferent or unholy thing when compared or opposed to the ideal to be realized. So precisely, in perception, flying impressions come to be regarded as illusory when contrasted with a stable conception of reality. Yet, of course, flying impressions are the only material out of which that conception can be formed. Life itself is a flying impression, and had we no personal and instant experience importuning us at each successive moment, we should have no occasion to ask for a reality at all, and no materials out of which to construct such a gratuitous an idea. In the same way, present demands are the only materials and occasions for any ideal. Without demands, the ideal would have no locus standi, or foothold in the world, no power, no charm, and no prerogative. If the ideal can confront particular desires and put them to shame, that happens only because the ideal is the object of a more profound and voluminous desire, and embodies the good which they blindly and perhaps deviously pursue. Demands could not be misdirected, goods sought could not be false, if the standard by which they are to be corrected were not constructed out of them. Otherwise each demand would render its object a detached, absolute, and unimpeachable good. But when each desire in turn has singed its wings and retired before some dissolution, reflection may set in to suggest residual satisfactions that may still be possible, or some shifting of the ground by which much of what was hoped for may yet be attained. Side note: discipline of the will. Side note: demands made practical and consistent. The force for this new trial is but the old impulse renewed. This new hope is a justified remnant of the old optimism. Each passion, in this second campaign, takes the field conscious that it has indomitable enemies and ready to sign a reasonable peace, and even to capitulate before superior forces. Such tameness may be at first merely a consequence of exhaustion and prudence, but a mortal will, though absolute in its deliverances, is very far from constant, and its sacrifices soon constitute a habit, its exile a new home. The old ambition, now proved to be unrealizable, begins to seem capricious and extravagant. The circle of possible satisfactions becomes the field of conventional happiness. Experience, which brings about this humbler and more prosaic state of mind, has its own imaginative fruits. Among those forces which compelled each particular impulse to abate its pretensions, the most conspicuous were other impulses, other interests active in oneself and in one's neighbours. When the power of these alien demands is recognized, they begin, in a physical way, to be respected. When an adjustment to them is sought, they begin to be understood, for it is only by studying their expression and tendency that the degree of their hostility can be measured. But to understand is more than to forgive. It is to adopt. And the passion that thought merely to withdraw into a sullen and maimed self-indulgence can feel itself expanded by sympathies which in its primal vehemence it would have excluded altogether. Experience, in bringing humility, brings intelligence also. Personal interests begin to seem relative, factors only in a general voluminous welfare, expressed in many common institutions and arts, moulds for whatever is communicable or rational in every passion. Each original impulse, when trimmed down more or less according to its degree of savageness, can then inhabit the state, and every good, when sufficiently transfigured, can be found again in the general idea. The factors may indeed often be unrecognizable in the result, so much does the process of domestication transform them. But the interests that animated them survive this discipline, and the new purpose is really esteemed. Else the ideal would have no moral force. An ideal representing no living interest would be irrelevant to practice, just as a conception of reality would be irrelevant to perception which should not be composed of the materials that sense supplies, or should not re-embody actual sensations in an intelligible system. Sidenote: the ideal natural. Here we have then one condition which the ideal must fulfill. It must be a resultant or synthesis of impulses already afoot. An ideal out of relation to the actual demands of living beings is so far from being an ideal that it is not even a good. The pursuit of it would be not the acme but the atrophy of moral endeavour. Mysticism and asceticism run into this danger. When they intend to be faithful to a supreme good too symbolically presented, breeds a superstitious repugnance toward everything naturally prized. So also an artificial skepticism can regard all experience as deceptive, by contrasting it with the chimera of an absolute reality. As an absolute reality would be indescribable and without a function in the elucidation of phenomena, so a supreme good which was good for nobody would be without conceivable value. Respect for such an idol is a dialectical superstition, and if zeal for that shibboleth should actually begin to inhabit the exercise of intelligent choice or the development of appreciation for natural pleasures, it would constitute a reversal of the life of reason, which, if persistently indulged in, could only issue in madness or revert to imbecility. End of chapter 11, part 1. Second part of chapter 11 of the first volume of The Life of Reason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Fredrik Karlsson. The Life of Reason by George Santayana. Side note: need of unity and finality. Side note: ideals of nothing. No less important, however, than this basis which the ideal must have in extant demands is the harmony with which reason must endow it. If without the one the ideal loses its value, without the other it loses its finality. Human nature is fluid and imperfect. Its demands are expressed in incidental desires, elicited by a variety of objects which perhaps cannot coexist in the world. If we merely transcribe these miscellaneous demands, or allow these floating desires to dictate to us the elements of the ideal, we shall never come to a whole or to an end. One new fancy after another will seem an embodiment of perfection, and we shall contradict each expression of our ideal by every other. A certain school of philosophy, if we may give that name to the systematic neglect of reason, has so immersed itself in the contemplation of this sort of inconstancy, which is indeed prevalent enough in the world, that it has mistaken it for a normal and necessary process. The greatness of the ideal has been put in its vagueness and in an elasticity which makes it wholly indeterminate and inconsistent. The goal of progress, beside being thus made to lie at every point of the compass in succession, is removed to an infinite distance, whereby the possibility of attaining it is denied and progress itself is made illusory. For a progress must be directed to attaining some definite type of life, the counterpart of a given natural endowment, and nothing can be called an improvement which does not contain an appreciable benefit. A victory would be a mockery that left us, for some new reason, as much impeded as before and as far removed from peace. The picture of life as an eternal war for illusory ends was drawn at first by satirists, unhappily with too much justification in the facts. Some grosser minds, too undisciplined to have ever pursued a good, either truly attainable or truly satisfactory, then proceeded to mistake that satire on human folly for a sober account of the whole universe, and finally others were not ashamed to represent it as the ideal itself. So soon is the dyer's hand subdued to what it works in. A barbarous mind cannot conceive life, like health, as a harmony continually preserved or restored, and containing those natural and ideal activities which disease merely interrupts. Such a mind, never having tasted order, cannot conceive it, and identifies progress with new conflicts and life with continual death. Its deification of unreason, instability, and strife comes partly from piety and partly from inexperience. There is piety in saluting nature in her perpetual flux, and in thinking that since no equilibrium is maintained for ever, none, perhaps, deserves to be. There is inexperience in not considering that wherever interests and judgments exist, the natural flux has fallen, so to speak, into a vortex, and created a natural good, a cumulative life, and an ideal purpose. Art, science, government, human nature itself are self-defining and self-preserving. By partly fixing a structure, they fix an ideal. But the barbarian can hardly regard such things, for to have distinguished and fostered them would be to have founded a civilization. Side note: Darwin on moral sense. Reason's function in defining the ideal is in principle extremely simple, although all time and all existence would have to be gathered in before the applications of that principle could be exhausted. A better example of its essential working could hardly be found than one which Darwin gives to illustrate the natural origin of moral sense. A swallow, impelled by migratory instincts to leave a nest full of unfledged young, would endure a moral conflict. The more lasting impulse, memory being assumed, would prompt a moral judgment when it emerged again after being momentarily obscured by an intermittent passion. Quote, "While the mother bird is feeding or brooding over her nestlings, the maternal instinct is probably stronger than the migratory, but the instinct which is more persistent gains the victory, and at last, at a moment when her young ones are not in sight, she takes flight and deserts them. When arrived at the end of her long journey and the migratory instinct ceases to act, what an agony of remorse each bird would feel if, from being endowed with great mental activity, she could not prevent the image continually passing before her mind of her young ones perishing in the bleak north from cold and hunger." End quote. Footnote E. Descent of Man, chapter 3. She would doubtless upbraid herself, like any sinner, for a senseless perfidy to her own dearest good. The perfidy, however, was not wholly senseless, because the forgotten instinct was not less natural and necessary than the remembered one, and its satisfaction no less true. Temptation has the same basis as duty. The difference is one of the volume and permanence in the rival satisfactions, and the attitude conscience will assume toward these depends more on the representability of the demands compared than on their original vehemence or ultimate results. Side-note: Conscience and reason compared. A passionate conscience may thus arise in the play of impulses differing in permanence, without involving a judicial exercise of reason. Nor does such a conscience involve a synthetic ideal, but only the ideal presence of particular demands. Conflicts in the conscience are thus quite natural and would continually occur but for the narrowness that commonly characterizes a mind inspired by passion. A life of sin and repentance is as remote as possible from a life of reason. Yet the same situation which produces conscience and the sense of duty is an occasion for applying reason to action and for forming an ideal, so soon as the demands and satisfactions concerned are synthesized and balanced imaginatively. The stork might do more than feel the conflict of his two impulses. He might do more than embody in alternation the eloquence of two hostile thoughts. He might pass judgment upon them impartially and, in the felt presence of both, conceive what might be a union or compromise between them. This resultant object of pursuit, conceived in reflection and itself the initial goal of neither impulse, is the ideal of a mind occupied by the two. It is the aim prescribed by reason under the circumstances. It differs from the prescriptions of conscience in that conscience is often the spokesman of one interest or of a group of interests in opposition to other primary impulses which it would annul altogether, while reason and the ideal are not active forces nor embodiments of passion at all, but merely a method by which objects of desire are compared in reflection. The goodness of an end is felt inwardly by conscience. By reason it can be only taken up in trust and registered as a fact. For conscience, the object of an opposed will is an evil. For reason, it is a good on the same ground as any other good, because it is pursued by a natural impulse and can bring a real satisfaction. Conscience, in fine, is a party to moral strife, reason an observer of it who, however, plays the most important and beneficent part in the outcome by suggesting the terms of peace. This suggested peace, inspired by sympathy and by knowledge of the world, is the ideal, which borrows its value and practical force from the irrational impulses which it embodies, and borrows its final authority from the truth with which it recognizes them all, and the necessity by which it imposes on each such sacrifices as are requisite to a general harmony. [Sidenote: Reason imposes no new sacrifice. Could each impulse, apart from reason, gain perfect satisfaction, it would doubtless laugh at justice. The divine, to exercise suasion, must use an argumentum ad hominem. Reason must justify itself to the heart. But perfect satisfaction is what an irresponsible impulse can never hope for. All other impulses, though absent perhaps from the mind, are none the less present in nature and have possession of the field through their physical basis. They offer effectual resistance to a reckless intruder. To disregard them is therefore to gain nothing. Reason, far from creating the partial renunciation and proportionate sacrifices which it imposes, really minimizes them by making them voluntary and fruitful. The ideal, which may seem to wear so severe a frown, really fosters all possible pleasures. What it retrenches is nothing to what blind forces and natural catastrophes would otherwise cut off, while it sweetens what it sanctions, adding to spontaneous enjoyments a sense of moral security and an intellectual light. [Sidenote: Natural goods attainable and compatible in principle. Those who are guided only by an irrational conscience can hardly understand what a good life would be. Their utopias have to be supernatural in order that the irresponsible rules which they call morality may lead by miracle to happy results. But such a magical and undeserved happiness, if it were possible, would be unsavory. Only one phase of human nature would be satisfied by it, and so impoverished an ideal cannot really attract the will. For human nature has been moulded by the same natural forces among which its ideal has to be fulfilled, and, apart from a certain margin of wild hopes and extravagances, the things man's heart desires are attainable under his natural conditions and would not be attainable elsewhere. The conflict of desires and interests in the world is not radical any more than man's dissatisfaction, which his own nature can be. For every particular ideal, being an expression of human nature in operation, must in the end involve the primary human faculties and cannot be essentially compatible with any other ideal which involves them too. To adjust all demands to one ideal and adjust that ideal to its natural conditions, in other words, to live the life of reason, is something perfectly possible. For those demands, being akin to one another in spite of themselves, can be better furthered by cooperation than by blind conflict, while the ideal, far from demanding any profound revolution in nature, merely expresses her actual tendency and forecasts what her perfect functioning would be. [Sidenote: Harmony the formal and intrinsic demand of reason. Reason as such represents, or rather constitutes, a single formal interest, the interest in harmony. When two interests are simultaneous and fall within one act of apprehension, the desirability of harmonizing them is involved in the very effort to realize them together. If attention and imagination are steady enough to face this implication and not to allow impulse to oscillate between irreconcilable tendencies, reason comes into being. Henceforth things actual and things desired are confronted by an ideal which has both pertinence and authority. End of chapter 11. First part of chapter 12 of the first volume of The Life of Reason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Fredrik Karlsson. The Life of Reason by George Santayana. Chapter 12. Flux and Constancy in Human Nature. Side note. Respectable tradition that human nature is fixed. A conception of something called human nature arises not unnaturally on observing the passions of men, passions which under various disguises seem to reappear in all ages and countries. The tendency of Greek philosophy, with its insistence on general concepts, was to define this idea of human nature still further and to encourage the belief that a single and identical essence present in all men determined their powers and ideal destiny. Christianity, while it transposed the human ideal and dwelt on the superhuman affinities of man, did not abandon the notion of a specific humanity. On the contrary, such a notion was implied in the fall and redemption, in the sacraments, and in the universal validity of Christian doctrine and precept. For if human nature were not one, there would be no propriety in requiring all men to preserve unanimity in faith or conformity in conduct. Human nature was likewise the entity which the English psychologists set themselves to describe, and Kant was so entirely dominated by the notion of a fixed and universal human nature that its constancy, in his opinion, was the source of all natural as well as moral laws. Had he doubted for a moment the stability of a human nature, the foundations of his system would have fallen out. The forms of perception and thought would at once have lost their boasted necessity, since tomorrow might dawn upon new categories and a modified a priori intuition of space or time, and the avenue would also have been closed by which man was led, through his unalterable moral sentiments, to assumptions about metaphysical truths. Side note. Contrary currents of opinion. Side note. Evolution. The force of this long tradition has been broken, however, by two influences of great weight in recent time: the theory of evolution and the revival of pantheism. The first has reintroduced flux into the conception of existence, and the second into the conception of values. If natural species are fluid and pass into one another, human nature is merely a name for a group of qualities found by chance in certain tribes of animals, a group to which new qualities are constantly tending to attach themselves, while other faculties become extinct, now in whole races, now in sporadic individuals. Human nature is therefore a variable, and its ideal cannot have a greater constancy than the demands to which it gives expression. Nor can the ideal of one man or one age have any authority over another, since the harmony existing in their nature and interests is accidental, and each is a transitional phase in an indefinite evolution. The crystallization of moral forces at any moment is consequently to be explained by universal, not by human laws. The philosopher's interest cannot be to trace the implications of present and unstable desires, but rather to discover the mechanical law by which these desires have been generated and will be transformed, so that they will change irrevocably both their basis and their objects. [Sidenote: Pantheism.] To this picture of physical instability furnished by popular science are to be added the mystical self-denials involved in pantheism. These come to reinforce the doctrine that human nature is a shifting thing, with the sentiment that it is a finite and unworthy one. For every determination of being, it is said, has its significance as well as its origin in the infinite continuum of which it is a part. Forms are limitations, and limitations, according to this philosophy, would be defects, so that man's only goal would be to escape humanity and lose himself in the divine nebula that has produced and must invalidate each of his thoughts and ideals. As there would be but one spirit in the world, and that infinite, so there would be but one ideal, and that indiscriminate. The despair which the naturalist's view of human instability might tend to produce is turned by this mystical initiation into a sort of ecstasy, and the deluge of conformity suddenly submerges that life of reason which science seemed to condemn to gradual extinction. [Sidenote: Instability in existences does not dethrone their ideals. Reason is a human function, though the name of reason has been applied to various alleged principles of cosmic life, vital or dialectical. These principles all lack the essence of rationality, in that they are not conscious movements toward satisfaction, not, in other words, moral and beneficent principles at all. Be the instability of human nature what it may, therefore, the instability of reason is not less, since reason is but a function of human nature. However relative and subordinate in a physical sense human ideals may be, these ideals remain the only possible moral standards for man, the only tests which he can apply for value or authority in any other quarter. And among unstable and relative ideals none is more relative and unstable than that which transports all value to a universal law, itself indifferent to good and evil, and worships it as a deity. Such an idolatry would indeed be impossible if it were not partial and veiled, arrived at in following out some human interest and clung to by force of moral inertia and the ambiguity of words. In truth, mystics do not practice so entire a renunciation of reason as they preach. Eternal validity and the capacity to deal with absolute reality are still assumed by them to belong to thought or at least to feeling. Only they overlook in their description of human nature just that faculty which they exercise in their speculation. Their map leaves out the ground on which they stand. The rest, which they are not identified with for the moment, they proceed to regard de haut en bas, and to discredit as a momentary manifestation of universal laws, physical or divine. They forget that this faith in law, this absorption in the blank reality, this enthusiasm for the ultimate thought are mere human passions like the rest, that they endure them as they might a fever, and that the animal instincts are patent on which those spiritual yearnings repose. [Sidenote: Absolutist philosophy human and halting. This last fact would be nothing against the feelings in question if they were not made vehicles for absolute revelations. On the contrary, such a relativity in instincts is the source of their importance. In virtue of this relativity they have some basis and function in the world, for did they not repose on human nature they could never express or transform it. Religion and philosophy are not always beneficent or important, but when they are, it is precisely because they help to develop human faculty and to enrich human life. To imagine that by means of them we can escape from human nature and survey it from without is an ostrich-like illusion obvious to all but to the victim of it. Such a pretension may cause admiration in the schools, where self-hypnotization is easy, but in the world it makes its professors ridiculous. For in their eagerness to empty their mind of human prejudices they reduce its rational burden to a minimum, and if they still continue to dogmatize, it is sport for the satirist to observe what forgotten accident of language or training has survived the crash of the universe and made the one demonstrable path to absolute truth. Sidenote: all science a deliverance of momentary thought. Neither the path of abstraction followed by the mystics nor that of direct and, as it avers, unbiased observation followed by the naturalists can lead beyond that region of common experience, traditional feeling, and conventional thought which all minds enter at birth and can elude only at the risk of inward collapse and extinction. The fact that observation involves the senses and the senses their organs is one which a naturalist can hardly overlook, and when we add that logical habits, sanctioned by utility, are needed to interpret the data of sense, the humanity of science and all its constructions becomes clearer than day. Superstition itself could not be more human. The path of unbiased observation is not a path away from conventional life. It is a progress in conventions. It improves human belief by increasing the proportion of two of its ingredients, attentive perception and practical calculus. The whole resulting vision, as it is sustained from moment to moment by present experience and instinct, has no value apart from actual ideals. And if it proves human nature to be unstable, it can build that proof on nothing more stable than human faculty as at that moment it happens to be. Sidenote: all criticism likewise. Nor is abstraction a less human process, as if by becoming very abstruse indeed we could hope to become divine. Is it not a commonplace of the schools that to form abstract ideas is the prerogative of man's reason? Is not abstraction a method by which mortal intelligence makes haste? Is it not the makeshift of a mind overloaded with its experience, the trick of an eye that cannot master a profuse and ever-changing world? Shall these diagrams drawn in fancy, this system of signals in thought, be the absolute truth dwelling within us? Do we attain reality by making a silhouette of our dreams? If the scientific world would be a product of human faculties, the metaphysical world must be doubly so. For the material there given to human understanding is here worked over again by human art. This constitutes the dignity and value of dialectic, that in spite of appearances it is so human. It bears to experience a relation similar to that which the arts bear to the same, where sensible images, selected by the artist's genius and already coloured by his aesthetic bias, are re-dyed in the process of reproduction whenever he has a great style, and saturated anew with his mind. There can be no question, then, of eluding human nature or of conceiving it and its environment in such a way as to stop its operation. We may take up our position in one region of experience or in another. We may, in unconsciousness of the interests and assumptions that support us, criticize the truth or value of results obtained elsewhere. Our criticism will be solid in proportion to the solidity of the unnamed convictions that inspire it, that is, in proportion to the deep roots and fruitful ramifications which those convictions may have in human life. Ultimate truth and ultimate value will be reasonably attributed to those ideas and possessions which can give human nature as it is the highest satisfaction. We may admit that human nature is variable, but that admission, if justified, will be justified by the satisfaction which it gives human nature to make it. We might even admit that human ideals are vain, but only if they were nothing worth for the attainment of the veritable human ideal. End of chapter 12, part 1. Second part of chapter 12 of the first volume of The Life of Reason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Fredrik Karlsson. The Life of Reason by George Santayana. Side note. Origin in essential. The given constitution of reason, with whatever a dialectical philosophy might elicit from it, obviously determines nothing about the causes that may have brought reason to its present pass or the phases that may have preceded its appearance. Certain notions about physics might no doubt suggest themselves to the moralist, who never can be the whole man. He might suspect, for instance, that the transitive intent of intellect and will pointed to their vital basis. Transcendence in operation might seem appropriate only to a being with a history and with an organism subject to external influences, whose mind should thus come to represent not merely its momentary state but also its constitutive past and its eventual fortunes. Such suggestions, however, would be extraneous to dialectical self-knowledge. They would be tentative only, and human nature would be freely admitted to be as variable, as relative, and as transitory as the natural history of the universe might make it. Side note. Ideals functional. The error, however, would be profound, and the contradiction hopeless, if we should deny the ideal authority of human nature because we have discovered its origin and conditions. Nature and evolution, let us say, have brought life to the present form, but this life lives, these organs have determinate functions, and human nature here and now, in relation to the ideal energies it unfolds, is a fundamental essence, a collection of activities with determinate limits, relations, and ideals. The integration and determinateness of these faculties is the condition for any synthetic operation of reason. As the structure of the steam engine has varied greatly since its first invention and its attributions have increased, so the structure of human nature has undoubtedly varied since man first appeared upon the earth. But as in each steam engine at each moment there must be a limit of mobility, a unity of function, and a clear determination of parts and tensions. So in human nature, as found at any time in any man, there is a definite scope by virtue of which alone he can have a reliable memory, a recognizable character, a faculty of connected thought and speech, a social utility, and a moral ideal. On man's given structure, on his activity hovering about fixed objects, depends the possibility of conceiving or testing any truth or making any progress in happiness. [Sidenote: They are transferable to similar beings.] Thinkers of different experience and organizations have pro tanto different logics and different moral laws. There are limits to communication even among beings of the same race, and the faculties and ideals of one intelligence are not transferable without change to any other. If this historic diversity in minds were complete, so that each lived in its own moral world, a science of each of these moral worlds would still be possible provided some inner fixity or constancy existed in its meanings. In every human thought, together with an immortal intent, there is a mortal and irrecoverable perception. Something in it perishes instantly, the part that can be materially preserved being proportionate to the stability or fertility of the organ that produced it. If the function is imitable, the object it terminates in will reappear, and two or more moments having the same ideal will utter comparable messages and may perhaps be unanimous. Unanimity in thought involves identity of functions and similarity in organs. These conditions mark off the sphere of rational communication and society. Where they fail altogether, there is no mutual intelligence, no conversation, no moral solidarity. [Sidenote: Authority internal.] The inner authority of reason, however, is no more destroyed because it has limits in physical expression or because irrational things exist than the grammar of a given language is invalidated because other languages do not share it, or because some people break its rules and others are dumb altogether. Innumerable madmen make no difference to the laws of thought, which borrow their authority from the inward intent and cogency of each rational mind. Reason, like beauty, is its own excuse for being. It is useful, indeed, for living well, when to give reason, satisfaction is made the measure of good. The true philosopher, who is not one chiefly by profession, must be prepared to tread the winepress alone. He may indeed flourish like the bay tree in a grateful environment, but more often he will rather resemble a reed shaken by the wind. Whether starved or fed by the accidents of fortune, he must find his essential life in his own ideal. In spiritual life, heteronomy is suicide. That universal soul sometimes spoken of, which is to harmonize and correct individual demands, if it were a will and an intelligence in act, would itself be an individual like the others, while if it possessed no will and no intelligence, such as individuals may have, it would be a physical force or law, a dynamic system without moral authority and with a merely potential or represented existence. For to be actual and self-existent is to be individual. The living mind cannot surrender its rights to any physical power or subordinate itself to any figment of its own art without falling into manifest idolatry. Side note: reason autonomous. Human nature, in the sense in which it is the transcendental foundation of all science and morals, is a functional unity in each man. It is no general or abstract essence, the average of all men's characters, nor even the complex of qualities common to all men. It is the entelechy of the living individual, be he typical or singular. That his type should be odd or common is merely a physical accident. If he can know himself by expressing the entelechy of his own nature in the form of a consistent ideal, he is a rational creature after his own kind, even if, like the angels of St. Thomas, he be the only individual of his species. What the majority of human animals may tend to, or what the past or future variations of a race may be, has nothing to do with determining the ideal of human nature in a living man, or in an ideal society of men bound together by spiritual kinship. Otherwise Plato could not have reasoned well about the Republic without adjusting himself to the politics of Buddha or Rousseau, and we should not be able to determine our own morality without making concessions to the cannibals or giving a vote to the ants. Within the field of an anthropology that tests humanity by the skull's shape, there might be room for any number of independent moralities, and although, as we shall see, there is actually a similar foundation in all human and even in all animal natures which supports a rudimentary morality common to all, yet a perfect morality is not really common to any two men nor to any phases of the same man's life. Side-note: its distribution. The distribution of reason, though a subject irrelevant to pure logic or morals, is one naturally interesting to a rational man, for he is concerned to know how far beings exist with a congenial structure and an ideal akin to his own. That circumstance will largely influence his happiness if, being a man, he is a gregarious and sympathetic animal. His moral idealism itself will crave support from others, if not to give it direction, at least to give it warmth and courage. The best part of wealth is to have worthy heirs, and mind can be transmitted only to a kindred mind. Hostile natures cannot be brought together by mutual invective nor harmonized by the brute destruction and disappearance of either party. But when one or both parties have actually disappeared and the combat has ceased for lack of combatants, nature, not hostile to one another, can fill the vacant place. In proportion to their inbred unanimity, these will cultivate a similar ideal and rejoice together in its embodiment. Side-note: natural selection of minds. This has happened to some extent in the whole world, on account of natural conditions which limit the forms of life possible in one region. For nature is intolerant in her laxity and punishes too great originality and heresy with death. Such moral integration has occurred very markedly in every good race and society whose members, by adapting themselves to the same external forces, have created and discovered their common soul. Spiritual unity is a natural product. There are those who see a great mystery in the presence of eternal values and impersonal ideals in a moving and animal world, and think to solve that dualism, as they call it, by denying that nature can have spiritual functions or spirit a natural cause. But nothing can be simpler if we make, as we should, existence the test of possibility. Ab esse ad posse valet illatio. Nature is a perfect garden of ideals, and passion is the perpetual and fertile soil for poetry, myth, and speculation. Nor is this origin merely imputed to ideals by a late and cynical observer. It is manifest in the ideals themselves, by their subject matter and intent. For what are ideals about? What do they idealize, except natural existence and natural passions? That would be a miserable and superfluous ideal indeed, that was nobody's ideal of nothing. The pertinence of ideals binds them to nature, and it is only the worst and flimsiest ideals, the ideals of a sick soul, that elude nature's limit and belie her potentialities. Ideals are forerunners or heralds of nature's successes, not always followed, indeed, by their fulfilment, for nature is but nature and has to feel her way, but they are an earnest, at least, of an achieved organization, an incipient accomplishment that tends to maintain and root itself in the world. To speak of nature's successes is, of course, to impute success retroactively. But the expression may be allowed when we consider that the same functional equilibrium which is looked back upon as a good by the soul it serves, first creates individual being and with it creates the possibility of preference and the whole moral world. And it is more than a metaphor to call that achievement a success which has made a sense of success possible and actual. That nature cannot intend or previously esteem those formations which are the conditions of value or intention existing at all, is a truth too obvious to demand repetition. But when those formations arise, they determine estimation, and fix the direction of preference, so that the evolution which produced them, when looked back upon from the vantage ground thus gained, cannot help seeming to have been directed toward the good now distinguished and partly attained. For this reason creation is regarded as a work of love, and the power that brought order out of chaos is called intelligence. End of chapter 12, part 2. Third part of chapter 12 of the first volume of The Life of Reason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Fredrik Karlsson. The Life of Reason by George Santayana. Side note: living stability. These natural formations, tending to generate and realize each its ideal, are, as it were, eddies in the universal flux, produced no less mechanically, doubtless, than the onward current, yet seeming to arrest or to reverse it. Inheritance arrests the flux by repeating a series of phases with a recognizable rhythm. Memory reverses it by modifying this rhythm itself by the integration of earlier phases into those that supervene. Inheritance and memory make human stability. This stability is relative, being still a mode of flux, and consists fundamentally in repetition. Repetition marks some progress on mere continuity, since it preserves form and disregards time and matter. Inheritance is repetition on a large scale, not excluding spontaneous variation, while habit and memory are a sort of heredity within the individual, since here an old perception reappears by way of atavism in the midst of a forward march. Life is thus enriched and reaction adapted to a wider field, much as a note is enriched by its overtones and by the tensions inherited from the preceding notes which give it a new setting. [Sidenote: Continuity necessary to progress. Progress, far from consisting in change, depends on retentiveness. When change is absolute, there remains no being to improve and no direction is set for possible improvement. And when experience is not retained, as among savages, infancy is perpetual. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. In the first stage of life the mind is frivolous and easily distracted. It misses progress by failing in consecutiveness and persistence. This is the condition of children and barbarians, in whom instinct has learned nothing from experience. In a second stage men are docile to events, plastic to new habits and suggestions, yet able to graft them on original instincts, which they thus bring to fuller satisfaction. This is the plane of manhood and true progress. Last comes a stage when retentiveness is extorted and all that happens is at once forgotten. A vain, because unpractical, repetition of the past takes the place of plasticity and fertile readaptation. In a moving world readaptation is the price of longevity. The hard shell, far from protecting the vital principle, condemns it to die down slowly and be gradually chilled. Immortality in such a case must have been secured earlier, by giving birth to a generation plastic to the contemporary world and able to retain its lessons. Thus old age is as forgetful as youth, and more incorrigible. It displays the same inattentiveness to conditions, its memory becomes self-repeating and degenerates into an instinctive reaction, like a bird's chirp. [Sidenote: Limits of variation, spirit a heritage.] Not all readaptation, however, is progress, for ideal identity must not be lost. The Latin language did not progress when it passed into Italian. It died. Its amiable heirs may console us for its departure, but do not remove the fact that their parent is extinct. So every individual, nation, and religion has its limits of adaptation. So long as the increment it receives is digestible, so long as the organization already attained is extended and elaborated without being surrendered, growth goes on. But when the foundation itself shifts, when what is gained at the periphery is lost at the center, the flux appears again and progress is not real. Thus a succession of generations or languages or religions constitutes no progress unless some ideal present at the beginning is transmitted to the end and reaches a better expression there. Without this stability at the core, no common standard exists, and all comparison of value with value must be external and arbitrary. Retentiveness, we must repeat, is the condition of progress. The variation human nature is open to is not, then, variation in any direction. There are transformations that would destroy it. So long as it endures, it must retain all that constitutes it now, all that it has so far gathered and worked into its substance. The genealogy of progress is like that of man, who can never repudiate a single ancestor. It starts, so to speak, from a single point, free as yet to take any direction. When once, however, evolution has taken a single step, say in the direction of vertebrates, that step cannot be retraced without extinction of the species. Such extinction may take place while progress in other lines is continued. All that preceded the forking of the dead and the living branch will be as well represented
and as legitimately continued by the surviving radiates as it could have been by the vertebrates that are no more. But the vertebrate ideal is lost forever, and no more progress is possible along that line. [Sidenote: Perfectibility.] The future of moral evolution is accordingly infinite, but its character is more and more determinate at every step. Mankind can never, without perishing, surrender its animal nature, its need to eat and drink, its sexual method of reproduction, its vision of nature, its faculty of speech, its arts of music, poetry, and building. Particular races cannot subsist if they renounce their savage instincts, but die, like wild animals die, in captivity; and particular individuals die when not suffered any longer to retain their memories, their bodies, or even their master passions. Thus human nature survives amid a continual fluctuation of its embodiments. At every step twigs and leaves are thrown out that last but one season, but the underlying stem may have meantime grown stronger and more luxuriant. Whole branches sometimes wither, but others may continue to bloom. Spiritual unity runs, like sap, from the common root to every uttermost flower, but at each forking in the growth the branches part company, and what happens in one is no direct concern of the others. The products of one age and nation may well be unintelligible to another, the elements of humanity common to both may lie lower down, so that the highest things are communicable to the fewest persons, and yet among these few are the most perfectly communicable. The more elaborate and determinate a man's heritage and genius are, the more he has in common with his next of kin, and the more he can transmit and implant in his posterity for ever. Civilization is cumulative. The farther it goes, the intenser it is, substituting articulate interests for animal fumes and for enigmatic passions. Such articulate interest can be shared, and the infinite vistas they open up can be pursued for ever with the knowledge that a work long ago begun is being perfected and that an ideal is being embodied which need never be outworn. [Sidenote: Nature and human nature.] So long as external conditions remain constant, it is obvious that the greater organization a being possesses, the greater strength he will have. If indeed primary conditions varied, the finer creatures would die first, for their adaptation is more exquisite and the irreversible core of their being much larger relatively. But in a constant environment their equipment makes them irresistible and secures their permanence and multiplication. Now man is a part of nature and her organization may be regarded as the foundation of his own. The word nature is therefore less equivocal than it seems, for every nature is nature herself, in one of her more specific and better articulated forms. Man therefore represented the universe that sustains him. His existence is a proof that the cosmic equilibrium that fostered his life is a natural equilibrium, capable of being long maintained. Some of the ancients thought it eternal. Physics now suggests a different opinion. But even if this equilibrium, by which the stars are kept in their courses and human progress is allowed to proceed, is fundamentally unstable, it shows what relative stability nature may attain. Could this balance be preserved indefinitely, no one knows what wonderful adaptations might occur within it, and to what excellence human nature in particular might arrive. Nor is it unlikely that before the cataclysm comes time will be afforded for more improvement than moral philosophy has ever dreamed of. For it is remarkable how inane and unimaginative utopias have generally been. This possibility is not uninspiring and may help to console those who think the natural conditions of life are not conditions that a good life can be lived in. The possibility of essential progress is bound up with the tragic possibility that progress and human life should some day end together. If the present equilibrium of forces were eternal, all adaptations to it would have already taken place, and, while no essential catastrophe would need to be dreaded, no essential improvement could be hoped for in all eternity. I am not sure that a humanity such as we know, were it destined to exist forever, would offer a more exhilarating prospect than a humanity having indefinite elasticity together with a precarious tenure of life. Mortality has its compensations. One is that all evils are transitory, another that better times may come. [Sidenote: Human nature formulated. Human nature, then, has for its core the substance of nature at large, and is one of its more complex formations. Its determination is progressive. It varies indefinitely in its historic manifestations and fades into what, as a matter of natural history, might no longer be termed human. At each moment it has its fixed and determinate entelechy, the ideal of that being's life, based on his instincts, summed up in his character, brought to a focus in his reflection, and shared by all who have attained or may inherit his organization. His perceptive and reasoning faculties are parts of human nature, as embodied in him. All objects of belief or desire, with all standards of justice and duty which he can possibly acknowledge, are transcripts of it, conditioned by it, and justifiable only as expressions of its inherent tendencies. [Sidenote: Its concrete description reserved for the sequel. This definition of human nature, clear as it may be in itself and true to the facts, will perhaps hardly make sufficiently plain how the life of reason, having a natural basis, has in the ideal world a creative and absolute authority. A more concrete description of human nature may accordingly not come amiss, especially as the important practical question touching the extension of a given moral authority over times and places depends on the degree of kinship found among the creatures inhabiting those regions. To give a general picture of human nature and its rational functions will be the task of the following books. The truth of a description, which must be largely historical, may not be indifferent to the reader, and I shall study to avoid bias in the presentation, in so far as is compatible with frankness and brevity. Yet even if some bias should manifest itself, and if the picture were historically false, the rational principles we shall be trying to illustrate will not thereby be invalidated. Illustrations might have been sought in some fictitious world, if imagination had not seemed so much less interesting than reality, which besides enforces with unapproachable eloquence the main principle in view, namely, that nature carries its ideal with it, and that the progressive organization of irrational impulses makes a rational life. End of chapter 12. End of volume 1 of The Life of Reason by George Santayana.